Picture a house burning to the ground. You might think, the hardest part of that tragedy is watching the flames consume the walls or feeling the intense heat as the roof collapses.
Right.
But the real profound crisis actually happens the next morning. It's standing in the cold ashes and realizing that the physical structure that completely defined your daily existence is just gone, and you suddenly have no idea who you are without it.
Exactly. I mean, the crisis isn't just the loss of the property itself. It's the sudden, really terrifying absence of the architecture that held your very identity together. You are left entirely exposed to the elements, and, well, your brain just doesn't know how to process that kind of sudden vacuum.
Welcome to The Debate. Today we are examining the nature of profound emotional transformation following immense grief and loss.
Yeah.
We're exploring this through the lens of Elizabeth Gilbert's experiences in All the Way to the River, which details her really harrowing, transformative journey with her terminally ill partner, Elias.
And it is a remarkable narrative because it completely strips away all the romanticism of grief. It forces us to look at the exact mechanics of how human beings survive when the most important anchor in their life is violently ripped away, whether that's a partner dying, a really messy divorce, or a total career collapse.
Exactly. And that brings us to the core of our discussion today. The question we are debating is this: is the intense transformation that follows deep personal loss best understood as a spiritual awakening driven by a complete surrender to grief? Or is it fundamentally a process of structured psychological recovery from trauma and codependency?
Right.
So, my position is this. I argue that profound grief shatters the ego, forcing a surrender that directly acts as a catalyst for genuine spiritual liberation and, ultimately, the discovery of an authentic identity.
And I take the position that this transformation is fundamentally a structured psychological recovery from severe process addiction and codependency. Viewing this purely as a mystical awakening, I think seriously risks obscuring the grueling, highly structural reality of how trauma recovery actually works.
Well, to see why I view this as a spiritual awakening, we have to look at the essence of Gilbert's journey, right? Which is liberation achieved specifically through the vehicle of loss. The central metaphor she uses is going all the way to the river. And this is about walking to the absolute edge of life, truth, and pain with another human being. When you are sitting with a dying partner, offering only your presence rather than, frantically trying to fix them or save them, it forces a complete and total surrender.
A forced surrender, maybe.
But a surrender nonetheless. You are brought to the very edge of the mystery of death, and at extreme proximity to the void, it cracks the soul open. By letting go of societal expectations, labels, and the need to constantly perform, grief actually transforms into a sacred teacher. It systematically strips away the false, ego-driven self, and that stripping away is what allows a direct connection with the divine, ultimately revealing true spiritual freedom.
See, I look at the exact same events and I see something entirely different. If you strip away the mystical, romantic language, what you're actually looking at is a textbook psychological crisis and an addiction recovery process.
Really? Addiction?
Yes, absolutely. Gilbert is remarkably explicit about her own pathology here. She openly admits to being a severe love and sex addict who suffered from a profound process addiction. She defines this as using other people to fill a God-sized hole and acting out constantly to control a trauma response.
Well, sure, she uses that terminology.
But it's not just terminology. What looks to you like a mystical surrender to grief was in reality a desperate, totally necessary psychological intervention. She hit an absolute rock bottom in an addictive cycle of extreme codependency, literally prioritizing her dying partner to the point of complete self-abandonment.
Okay, but
The resulting awakening is the direct result of rigorous, practical 12-step recovery work, radical boundary setting, and taking responsibility for her own nervous system. It is not some passive spiritual gift born out of the ether of grief.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the nature of that surrender. Because the spiritual mechanics become undeniable when we look closely at the caregiving phase. Her ability to eventually stop resisting, to stop fighting the terminal diagnosis of pancreatic and liver cancer, and to simply sit with the mystery of death. That is the ultimate spiritual surrender.
But was it peaceful?
It doesn't have to be peaceful to be spiritual. This specific type of grief, mourning a future that will never happen while the person is still sitting right in front of you, it forces an individual to live entirely in the present moment. There are no guarantees, no promises, only breath. Leaning into that silence, rather than trying to medically or practically fix the unfixable, is what precipitates this profound emotional rebirth. I mean, the ego demands solutions, right? The spirit simply accepts presence.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that framing. We really have to ask, was this actually a peaceful surrender to the mystery of death? Or was it a surrender to total powerlessness over a highly toxic, unmanageable situation?
It can be both.
But we cannot ignore the gritty reality of that caregiving environment. We are not talking about a serene, meditative passing with candles and soft music here.
No, we definitely aren't.
Right. Rhea, who was a former heroin addict, began deeply abusing opioids, cocaine, methadone, and alcohol while in hospice. She became abusive, demanding, degrading. The environment devolved into a dungeon of misery. We have the staggering image of a privileged, best-selling author walking into a New York City free clinic to get clean needles for her dying partner's heroin use, and actually being recognized by the staff.
Yeah, that is undeniably a dark and harrowing reality.
It is the absolute definition of rock bottom. And it's crucial to point out that her so-called surrender came only after she literally contemplated murder and suicide.
Wow.
Yes, the psychological weight of the codependency had reached a fatal pressure point. Her thought process was literally, I will kill her or I will kill myself to escape this. That is not a peaceful acceptance of grief. That is the breaking point of an enabler who can no longer manipulate a situation to get the emotional safety they're addicted to. Now look, most people listening to this haven't been pushed to the brink in a New York City needle exchange.
Right, thankfully.
But anyone who has stayed in a relationship long past its expiration date just to avoid the terror of being alone understands the exact mechanics of that psychological desperation. It's the moment the drug stops working.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. Because the spiritual and the desperate aren't mutually exclusive. I acknowledge the sheer darkness and the absolute degradation of that moment in the apartment, but it is exactly in that abyss that the spiritual transformation occurs.
How so?
In that exact moment of despair, when the thought of murder or suicide was present, she describes hearing God's voice penetrating the insanity. The voice said, if you have reached a point where you are seriously considering killing yourself or somebody else, you have very likely reached the end of your power.
That is the pivotal moment, the complete breakdown of the ego, the exhaustion of all human manipulation and control is precisely what allows the divine to enter. You cannot have a spiritual awakening while you still think you are in charge. The darkness you describe was the necessary crucible for the ego to shatter so that true spiritual surrender could finally take place.
I'll grant you that she experienced a profound moment of clarity in that darkness, but an epiphany doesn't rewire a nervous system.
Well,
The fascinating part isn't the voice she heard. It's the grueling, highly structured behavioral reprogramming she had to do the next morning to actually survive it. Let's look at the mechanics of what she actually did. The steps she took were grounded in established clinical psychological recovery frameworks.
I completely disagree that it was purely structural or clinical. The actual healing process she describes was incredibly intuitive and, frankly, deeply spiritual. It was centered around practices like two-way prayer, and then download that wisdom onto the page. Think about how that works on a human level. Anxiety lives in the mind's endless loops of past regret and future panic. By writing a question to a loving force and just listening, she forced her nervous system to shift from active panic to receptive stillness.
Right, but
It wasn't about rigid clinical exercises. It was about finding God in the silence. Furthermore, she used storytelling as a profound medicine. Not writing to be published, but writing to honor the love, name the pain, and transform the grief. The recovery of herself came through these quiet, organic spiritual practices, reclaiming joy in the smallest rituals, like lighting a candle, drinking tea, and allowing her soul to breathe again.
But the very practices you are describing as intuitive and mystical are explicitly structural tools drawn directly from 12-step recovery programs.
They are still spiritual practices.
Pioneered by the original founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's a cognitive behavioral interrupt. The concept of the God-sized hole, the infinite void that cannot be filled by money, fame, or other people, that is textbook addiction recovery vernacular. We cannot strip these practices of their clinical origins just because they feel poetic.
But the application of them in the aftermath of loss is highly personal. It requires faith, not just psychology.
Personal, yes, but rigorously bounded by psychological discipline. This wasn't just gentle journaling with a cup of tea. It was an extreme behavioral intervention. Consider the boundaries that had to be erected to survive this loss. She commits to a year of strict celibacy.
Right.
For someone who admits to a 35-year uninterrupted pattern of abandoning herself and to other people, celibacy is not a mystical retreat. Explain how that works. When you remove the external dopamine hit of another person's affection, the nervous system panics. It screams for its drug.
It does.
So celibacy was a vital psychological quarantine. She had to metabolize her own anxiety without using a human being as a pacifier. It is the structural reversal of what she terms the bad math of codependency.
Right, the bad math being, pouring 100% of your emotional resources into saving someone else.
And then standing outside a pawn shop begging for your own love back. Exactly. It's an energetic bankruptcy. The recovery she describes was the disciplined, unglamorous work of reversing that math. It meant structurally forcing all those resources back into herself. It meant attending daily meetings, working with a sponsor, and committing to a baseline rule of no abandonment of self. That is the definition of emotional sobriety. It is behavioral reprogramming, first and foremost.
Look, I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because it reduces a profound existential metamorphosis into a clinical checklist. Yes, the frameworks of recovery were utilized, but the actual transformation of identity completely transcends psychology. Think about the process of rebuilding an identity after massive change, like a divorce or a major life transition. Holding on to a codependent identity after your partner dies is like trying to navigate a sprawling city using a map from 1850.
That's a good analogy.
The roads you used to walk down literally do not exist anymore. You aren't just lost. Your entire instrument for finding your way is fundamentally broken. The ultimate liberation here wasn't just following rules. It was the spiritual release of deep-seated shame. It was looking back at the scared woman who made those mistakes and offering her unconditional compassion and forgiveness.
I absolutely agree that identity transformation is the central outcome here. In releasing shame is crucial. But how is that release actually achieved?
It is achieved through radical authenticity. Look at the physical manifestation of this spiritual shift. Her decision to shave her head. She describes sitting in a room full of media professionals, noting how comfortable the aging men were, and realizing how much money, time, and sheer discomfort the women had invested in their pretty girl masks.
Yeah.
Shaving her head wasn't a psychological boundary. It was throwing away the old map. It was a profound spiritual rejection of societal expectations, a post-beauty declaration of freedom. It physically represented a soul that no longer required external validation, a self that was finally free to jump into oceans and rivers without caring about the performance of identity.
The buzz cut is an incredibly powerful symbol, I'll give you that. It is a fantastic visual of rejecting the mask. But I think you're giving the universe credit for something she had to painstakingly earn through behavioral changes.
Earning it is part of the spiritual journey.
But letting go of shame and achieving that level of authenticity was only possible through intense psychological accountability. You cannot just forgive yourself in a vacuum. You have to confront the behaviors that generated the shame in the first place.
Which she did by sitting with the pain and acknowledging it in her writing.
But it goes far beyond just sitting with it. It requires confronting a history of severe active manipulation. She is unflinching about her past behavior. We see her admission of using a prestigious writing grant as a manipulative tool to trap Rhea in a church house for 9 months, simply because Rhea's physical presence regulated her own anxious nervous system.
It's hard to read, honestly.
Mary, we see the psychotic guilt over her sudden wealth, which manifested as her walking down the street in a small town, physically throwing money at strangers just to alleviate her own internal discomfort. A new authentic identity after massive life disruption isn't found merely by granting yourself mystical grace. It is earned by actively identifying and dismantling the deeply ingrained destructive psychological crutches that caused the trauma in the first place. You only get to that post-beauty freedom when you have rigorously taken total responsibility for your own own emotional survival.
I hear what you were saying about accountability, but I maintain that the driving force behind that accountability is love, not just discipline. When you lose the person who functioned as your sanctuary, your mirror, and your anchor, the resulting devastation is a spiritual initiation. The grief sweeps away everything that is false.
Yes, the behavioral changes are necessary, but they are the symptom of the spiritual awakening, not the cause of it. The cause is the pure, unadulterated heartbreak that leaves you with absolutely nothing but the divine. It requires a vulnerability that is fundamentally spiritual to look at your own shadows, to admit your own deep flaws, like the intense manipulation you just mentioned. It requires a grace that completely transcends the clinical. It requires the ability to say, I am deeply broken, but I am held. That is what allows a person to reclaim joy in small things without needing it to be a grand performance.
And I would counter that the divine, in this specific context, is simply the profound realization of one's own internal agency after decades of outsourcing it. When you make another human being your higher power, when you worship them to the point of enabling their self-destruction and your own, the physical death of that person forces a catastrophic psychological default.
Right.
The river she goes to isn't just a mystical destination. It represents the terrifying edge of one's own psychological limits. The beauty of her story isn't just that she found God in the silence. It is that she finally, painstakingly, stopped using drama, excitement, and other people to distract herself from her own anxiety.
But again, that realization is sparked by the profound emotional loss.
It is sparked by loss, yes, but sustained by intellectual honesty and psychological courage. The transition from being a crumaholic, someone literally begging for scraps of affection from a sick partner, to being someone who can look in the mirror and state, I will never leave you, to their own inner child, that is a triumph of mental health practices. It proves that surviving profound heartbreak requires us to stop performing, take off the mask, and face the unvarnished reality of our destructive patterns.
Well, we have covered immense ground today, moving from the depths of a hospice room to the quiet rituals of healing. To summarize my position, the evidence in Gilbert's journey demonstrates that grief and emotional loss are profoundly sacred experiences. While I absolutely acknowledge the messy, dark reality of addiction and codependency present in the narrative, the ultimate takeaway is that love and loss serve to strip away our superficial identities. They act as a fire that leaves us cracked open so that genuine spiritual liberation, unconditional self-love, and true authenticity can finally enter our lives.
And to summarize my perspective, while the emotional and spiritual narrative of loss is undeniably powerful, the material fundamentally illustrates that surviving a profound heartbreak requires confronting our deepest psychological crutches. True emotional rebirth does not come solely from a mystical surrender to the universe. It comes from the disciplined, often grueling, and highly unglamorous work of taking total responsibility for one's own emotional survival, setting radical boundaries, and actively dismantling our own toxic patterns.
Where we undoubtedly converge is on the realization that navigating the moments in life that quietly changes forever requires unflinching honesty. Whether a person is rebuilding an identity after the death of a partner, a painful divorce, a massive career failure, or a profound family transition, it demands the courage to stop performing. We have to drop our societal masks and face exactly who we are when our external anchors have been stripped away.
Absolutely. You cannot hide behind a polished, constructed persona when the fundamental structure of your life collapses. You have no choice but to evaluate the foundation that remains.
There is certainly far more depth to explore in this subject regarding how human beings heal, forge resilience, and find meaning after life-altering transitions.
Definitely.
We've only scratched the surface today, and we leave it to you, the listener, to consider these perspectives. A practical lesson to take away here is to evaluate those foundational maps you are using. If they no longer serve your reality, have the courage to let them go. And as a quick teaser, next time we gather, we're shifting gears entirely to explore the ruthless, fascinating mechanics of influence in the 48 Laws of Power.
That is going to be a completely different kind of conversation.
Oh, definitely. So feel free to leave a comment, suggest future books or topics, and make sure to follow along so you don't miss it. Think back to that burning house we discussed at the beginning. When the smoke finally clears and you are standing in the cold ashes of the life you used to know, what is the first thing you will choose to rebuild?